Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 39 of the Bible and Science. We've been talking about the supposed evolution of various types of fish, but now we're going to get to what many people just take for granted must have happened. Did fish come out of the water and turn into amphibians so that later on their descendants could turn into land animals? Well, we're going to look at that in some detail today. Did fish come out of the water and turn into amphibians? Every living thing has its characteristics because of the information in its DNA. So land-based organisms are supposed to have evolved from aquatic ancestors. So the ancestors, the sea-going creatures, would have acquired tremendous numbers of mutations in order to evolve to a land-based lifestyle. This is supposed to have happened during the Devonian. If you start out in the fossil record, you'd see at the bottom the Precambrian, the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, then you get up to the Devonian. This is where you have a lot of shallow water fish as well as the first of the land creatures. So some of the fish, crossopterygian fish belonging to a class called Osteichthyes, are supposed to have crawled out onto land and evolved into amphibians. Then the amphibians later became the ancestors of all land vertebrates, including later amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals such as you. So you're supposed to have come from an ape, but long before that, you came from a fish, according to evolution. So the amphibians, the creatures that start out living in the water and often can move onto land or go back and forth. Where did they come from? There are two basic ideas. One is initial disorganization, which is evolution, simple to complex. It says that life began about 3.5 billion years ago as a result of chemical accidents, remained in the water for about 3 billion years. So the first amphibians had to evolve from some sort of fish. These early fish, the ancestral fish, lived through the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and then the amphibians first evolved during the Devonian. Exclusively land-based animals wouldn't have done very well when everything was in the water. So the information in the ancestors' DNA, starting as whatever evolved into amphibians, gradually became more and more complex because of a great many accumulated mutations. Now, on the other hand, the initial complexity idea, creation from complex to simple, says that the strata that we see don't show evolution, but instead they represent ecological communities rather than time periods. That is, fish have always been fish, amphibians have always been amphibians. And we would believe that amphibians are not found below the Devonian because the lower strata, Cambrian, Ordovician, and so forth, they represent ocean-type biomes, ecological communities where amphibians do not live in the ocean. So we would expect that mutations in DNA would lead to deterioration rather than to increasing complexity. This is the most common textbook scenario that you'll see for the origin of amphibians. Some ancestral fish, exactly what it was, we don't know, but they're supposed to have lived in freshwater lakes during the Devonian. Some of them must have, all of these things are must have, acquired stronger fins due to mutations in their DNA. So now within the group that had stronger fins, some must have acquired additional mutations in their DNA to allow them to breathe in air without suffocating, but continue to breathe in water without drowning. And then another must have. There must have been lengthy periodic droughts that dried the lakes up. As this happened, the fish with the stronger fins and the ability to breathe air must have crawled out to other bodies of water. And meanwhile, DNA must have continued to mutate, improving the fins and the lungs. After many repetitions of this process, more mutations had to cause the strong fins to evolve into legs. So the ancestral fish, whatever they were, are supposed to have evolved into amphibians. The most common proposal is a cross-opterygian fish, such as Eusthenopteron, which you'll see at the lower left of your screen, and it must have evolved into an amphibian, such as Ichthyostega, that you'll see on the right side of the screen. That's the most common scenario. So the way this is supposed to have happened, according to the common scenario, is that Eusthenopteron, it was a Devonian fish, a cross-opterygian fish. It's considered an early form of coelacanth. Coelacanths were thought to be extinct ever since hundreds of millions of years ago, up until one was first caught off the coast of Madagascar in the 1930s. So the coelacanth is often shown, the Eusthenopteron, is often shown in displays with the things it's supposed to have possibly evolved into, Ichthyostega or Acanthostega. These are the two amphibians that are believed to have looked the most like Eusthenopteron. Well, is it reasonable to believe that coelacanths are the ancestors of land animals? If you consider living coelacanths, modern coelacanths, such as Latimeria, found off the coast of Madagascar, they do not use their so-called lungs to breathe. Those are used as swim bladders, like the ballast tanks on a submarine, to control buoyancy. They never use their fins for anything like walking. We've had deep-sea submersibles shadow them on the sea bottom and found out, no, they never do anything like walking. In fact, they live in the deep ocean rather than in shallow lakes or ponds. So there's an alternate candidate for the ancestors of amphibians. Some paleontologists reject coelacanths, and they see a different category of fish, the lungfishes, or dipnoids, as a better candidate for the ancestors of amphibians. Well, those are closer to the behavior of the supposedly earliest ancestors. In addition to using their lungs as swim bladders, some of them are able to use their lungs to breathe. And many of the lungfish do live in shallow lakes or ponds. Some are able to push themselves with their fins to slither across short distances on the land. There's an example of a Devonian lungfish, Uranophis wyomingensis, and then there's an artist's model of what it would have looked like with all of its flesh on it. And then another African lungfish, Protopterus. So this is an alternative ancestor for things like Ichthyostega. So what's the fossil transition? There is none. There's nothing showing a transition from either cross-opterygians or dipnoids to Ichthyostega or anything like it. No transitions. Now there's a serious anatomical problem with both types of proposed ancestors for amphibians. Every chordate, that's the phylum that includes the vertebrates, every member of phylum Chordata starts with a flexible rod of cells, not a hard backbone. It's called a notochord. In almost all vertebrates, including the amphibians, the notochord later develops into a segmented spine. Okay, so the two types of fish that have been proposed as possible ancestors of amphibians never develop a segmented spine. They're rare among the chordates, the vertebrates, in that most develop a segmented spine, but these two that are the hypothetical ancestor never develop a segmented spine like land animals and other creatures. They maintain an uninterrupted notochord throughout their lives. So we've got an ancestral line that's going to evolve into amphibians. It has DNA. Well, it's going to have to undergo a tremendous number of mutations to cause them to develop segmented spines because their ancestors did not have segmented spines. So they do all of the things necessary to evolve into amphibians except leaving out that one crucial step about the segmented spine. There's some other problems with fish evolving into amphibians, many problems. Living things get their physical characteristics, their phenotype, from the information in their DNA, their genotype. They don't get what they need, they get what their DNA gives them. So if fish evolved into amphibians, they would need mutations to produce a great many new structures and either change or eliminate old ones. For instance, okay, amphibians, do they all have legs? No. Some types of amphibians don't have any legs at all. But in all of them that do have legs, the legs are firmly attached to a pelvic girdle, which is like the pelvis. It's rigidly attached to the backbone. Okay, which fish have anything like this? Not a single fish has anything like a pelvic girdle. And then you've heard of people sticking their necks out. Well, fish can't because fish don't have necks. Many amphibians do have necks. And then, since it has a neck, the skull of a land-dwelling animal would no longer be supported by water. The muscles would have to be much stronger because it's going to be exposed to more force. Amphibians and fish have different numbers of bones in their skulls. They differ in both size and in the arrangement of the bones. A few other problems with fish evolving into amphibians. Most of a fish's weight is supported by water, so the fins do not experience much stress when it rests on the bottom. But a fish out of water would be subject to much greater forces. The fins, the supporting muscles, and the backbone would all have to be strong enough to support the full body weight. The circulatory system is different. The eyes would have to change so that they focused best in air rather than water. Also, they would need eyelids. All of these things are mutations in the DNA, one after another. They would need eyelids to prevent the drying out of the eyes when out of water. And then fish don't have eardrums. But ichthyostegid amphibians, from the fossils we can tell, oh, they did have eardrums. The breathing mechanism is different in fish than it is in amphibians. Even the fish that are able to breathe air are still better suited for water. Amphibian larvae breathe through gills, and once they mature, they're better suited to breathe in air. Some are also able to breathe through their skin. That's another interesting mutation in the DNA that had to come along. How do fish propel themselves? They sweep their body and the tail back and forth. And what do they use the fins for? Balance and steering. How about amphibians? How do they propel themselves? Mainly with the legs. And the legs are supposed to have been derived from fins. Fertilization, breeding. Some animals require internal fertilization. The male deposits sperm inside the female's body. Others use external fertilization, where the female ejects her eggs and then the male comes along and deposits its sperm on them. The living fish, supposed to be related to the ancestors of amphibians, use internal fertilization, sex. However, all but one type of known amphibians use external fertilization. So in order for each new type of amphibian to develop, there'd have to be a great many types of ancient fish where many males and many females living at the same time and in the same place experienced not just matching mutations but complementary mutations, so the male and female reproductive system would be able to work together. Here's another major difference between amphibians and fish that are supposed to be their ancestors. All living amphibians except for newts go through the process of metamorphosis to a greater or lesser extent. So if you're familiar with how frogs develop into tadpoles and then mature adults, you've seen metamorphosis. So if the first amphibians evolved through the mutations in the DNA of the fish, it would stand to reason they would have inherited the feature of metamorphosis from the DNA of their ancestors, crossopterygians or dipnoids. Yeah, here's the problem. Living crossopterygian fish and lungfish, dipnoids, do not undergo metamorphosis. The only types of fish known to go through that are the rayfin fish, subclass Actinopterygii. Some eels go through 5 stages over several years. That's complete metamorphosis. There are some flatfish, like flounders, they go through partial metamorphosis. Their skulls reform to place both eyes on the same size. And salmon undergo a partial metamorphosis where they can thrive in freshwater versus later they go into the saltwater. There's another group called Agnatha, that's the jawless fish that you'll find in the fossil record. Lampreys undergo complete metamorphosis. But other than that, the closest thing to partial metamorphosis is that fish embryos absorb the yolk sac in their eggs. None of these are considered relatives or ancestors of amphibians. So where'd the amphibians come from? We don't know. You know, as a creationist, I would say amphibians have always been amphibians, fish have always been fish, and so forth. But an evolutionist says, no, one developed into the other. So to summarize, if amphibians came from fish, the DNA of the ancestral fish would have had to undergo a great many mutations so as to produce at least these features: segmented backbones as opposed to notochords, a pelvic girdle where none existed before, a neck where none existed before, support for the skull. The bones in the skull would have been altered in number and arrangement. They would have had to develop strong fins and muscles and a backbone to support the animal when it crawled out of the water onto the land. Their circulatory system would have to modified. Their eyes would have had to become suited for air, and they'd also have to evolve eyelids to prevent drying of the eyes. Their hearing system would have to change so it was suited for air, including eardrums. Their means of propulsion would have had to change. Instead of the body and the tail, instead of the fins as found in fish, it would have had to change to body and tail as in amphibians. The breathing apparatus would have had to become better suited for water than air in fish and amphibian larvae, but in adult amphibians, it would have had to go the other way, so it was better suited for air than water. The fish would have had to go to a different system of reproduction where the amphibians most of the time use external fertilization, but the amphibians do internal fertilization and then metamorphosis in a great many of them. So remember, the scenario for how amphibians might have evolved is that there were periodic droughts drying up things, and so these fish had to crawl across the land. Crawling across the land in response to droughts would not produce all of these features. They all require a great many mutations in the DNA. Now I want to show you a cladogram because you're going to see it again on the next slide. These are made-up diagrams showing how things might have evolved. This is what the evolutionists will put out there to show this is how things evolved. Yeah, well, the problem is we don't have to actually base these on any evidence. Cladograms are made-up diagrams showing how things might have evolved. So you'll look on this one, and at the bottom left, you'll see Eusthenopteron, and it goes through all of these other stages until it gets up to Poderpes at the upper right, and it goes through the other stages, Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, Elginerpeton, and so forth. Yeah, each one of those represents a divergence from a presumed common ancestor, but notice that there's all question marks. That's because what common ancestor is known? None. Each one of these would have had to go two separate sets of mutations to produce two or more separate lines of descendants. While Eusthenopteron has no known ancestors, that's the one that's usually put forth as the ancestor of all of the amphibians. Well, what's its ancestor? Now, there's other fish. There's no known common ancestor for these other ones: Panderichthys, Alpistostega, Tiktaalik. There's not a known common ancestor for any of those pairs branching up. They're just purely made up. Well, initial disorganization evolution says the common ancestors have just not been found yet. Initial complexity creation says, no, we don't think they ever existed. So these are some of the alleged transitions from fish to amphibian. At the lower left, you'll see Eusthenopteron, which I've referred to several other times, and it would supposedly have gone through a number of other stages. There's a histocladogram showing the supposed fish abode evolution from Eusthenopteron to Panderichthys to Tiktaalik to Acanthostega and so forth. Well, okay, that's a very nice chart, but is it based upon common ancestor, known common ancestor? No. There's no common ancestor known for any two of those proposed transitions. So this is how the amphibians are supposed to have evolved from the fish. The usual scenario says that in the late Devonian, we had some fish, which we're not quite sure what they were, and they gradually evolved into Eusthenopteron, Panderichthys, and Tiktaalik, and so forth. Well, Tiktaalik is supposed to be an amphibian, but if you look on the left-hand side, the first four-legged tracks are known from, they're dated at 395 million years ago. Tiktaalik is dated about 375 to maybe 380, Eusthenopteron a bit earlier than that, but the time sequence is wrong. The amphibians appeared millions of years before the supposed transitions leading up to them. So tracks of four-limbed creatures have been found in at least 4 locations around the world. They're dated to 395 million years ago. The commonly accepted transition from water to land, Tiktaalik, is dated 383 million years ago. That's 12 million years too late according to the evolutionary time scale, which I don't buy anyway, and I hope you don't. So let's consider how amphibians are classified and have been classified. There are 9 orders of amphibians known. 6 of them are extinct. The labyrinthodons, that's the only one that looked like any of the fishes. Temnospondyls were water-dwelling. They had flat bodies, small limbs. The anthracosaurs are supposed to be the ancestors of reptiles. We'll get to that in the next episode. Lepospondyls, those are from early Mississippian to Permian. They had relatively simple types of vertebrae. We'll get to that in just a moment. Aistopods are long snake-like forms with up to 200 vertebrae. Most had no limbs at all, no pelvic girdle. Nectrodeians also included some with no legs. Microsaurias were small amphibians. That's the 6 extinct types, but there are also 3 living orders. Subclass Lissamphibia. That includes the salamanders and newts, and Cecilia looks very much like a worm. You would look at it and think it's a worm, but now actually it's a vertebrate. It just has no legs, no limbs at all. And then frogs and toads. Okay, so how did these things acquire those features? There are two main types of vertebrae in amphibians. Okay, the backbone is consisting either of lipospondylus vertebrae, that's found in the extinct amphibian orders, Istopoda, Nectaridae, and Microsauria, and there are also some living orders, Urodela, Apoda, and Anura. Those also have lipospondylus vertebrae. That's a single spool-shaped centrum. It turns into bone from surrounding tissue rather than the notochord. And there's also a neural arch on top where the spinal cord goes. This type is considered more primitive than the Rachytimus. It appears later in the fossil record, so you would expect it to be more complex. Now, there are no known common ancestors for the two different types of vertebrae. So that's a diplocalus spine showing the spool-shaped lipospondylus vertebrae. Why are they that way? Because of the DNA, not because they need anything, but because of the DNA. And the other type of vertebrae is called Rachytimus, which you find in several of the extinct orders, and you find them in reptiles. Okay, the two main types of amphibian vertebrae are Rachytimus. It's found in the extinct orders, and it seems to be more complex, more advanced, and yet it occurs much later in the geologic column. So if you look at the one on the lower right, that's a plesiosaur vertebrae. Many land animals, reptiles, and so forth have the Rachytimus type of vertebrae, and they also have reinforcements called zygapophyses. Okay, you're ready for a test on this, right? What is a zygapophysis? Well, these are protrusions from one vertebra to another, and they reinforce the backbone. Why do they come together like that? Because that's what's programmed into the DNA. These actually appear way out of sequence in the geologic timescale. So here's some examples of animals with Rachytimus vertebrae. You can see the Acanthostega and the Eustonopteron, the Simoria, Cacops. These things have the more advanced vertebrae, but they're found earlier in the fossil record. All three orders of the Paleozoic labyrinthodonts had the same type of vertebrae as reptiles and crosser-opterygian fish, but the fish didn't have the reinforcing zygapophyses. So how do we classify amphibians? There are 6 extinct orders divided into among 3 subclasses. Labyrinthodonts all had arch-type Rachytimus vertebrae, but they occurred earlier in the fossil record than the lipospondylus. The lipospondylus had the primitive vertebrae, but they're dated millions of years later than the Rachytimus. And then the 3 living orders have gone back to the primitive lipospondylus type of vertebrae. So we had some in the Paleozoic times, supposed times, that had the primitive vertebrae, and then amphibious that had the more advanced vertebrae, but then the modern ones go back to having the primitive vertebrae. So where are these on the geologic time scale? You can look through that at your leisure. All amphibians are supposed to have come through some fish-like labyrinthodont ichthyostega, but many of them had no legs at all. What are the transitions from one type to another? There have been no specific transitions proposed showing how any of the other amphibians might have evolved. The lipospondylus are considered more primitive than the other ones, but there are no forms proposed connected the two groups. And then the lipospondylus had spool-like vertebrae, didn't go through metamorphosis, if they had a common ancestor, the DNA had to be able to evolve in two different directions. List amphibians, which are modern amphibians, they go back to the primitive type vertebrae that you find in the early Paleozoic. Some of those do go through metamorphosis, but there have been no forms proposed connecting them to any type of extinct amphibians. So the commonly accepted ages for the Paleozoic types of fish and amphibians alleged to have come from them are shown on that chart. Well, all of the fish supposed to be developing into amphibians are found in the Devonian, which is a shallow water environment. A creationist like myself would take that to indicate an ecological community that's comfortable in shallow water, not something that's evolving. So, let's consider the arguments for and against amphibian evolution. Arguments for, evolution requires that it had to happen, period. Okay, then there are a number of fairly complete fossils as well as many incomplete ones supposed to represent a transition to amphibians, and they have an overall shape similar to fish, like the ichthyostegids. You can also arrange a number of fossils on a chart showing a gradual progression toward more and more amphibian-looking characteristics. Okay, that's the arguments for. The arguments against have to do with DNA. DNA is responsible for the physical structures in every living thing. What they look like is irrelevant. Overall shape does not matter. So the DNA of some ancestors would have had to evolve to produce segmented versus unsegmented spines, different types of vertebrae, pelvic girdles, thoracic girdles, which would be the equivalent of shoulders, change from fins to legs, metamorphosis versus non-metamorphosis, different breathing, vision, and hearing apparatus, different methods of fertilization, and different methods of propulsion. Now, if you want to continue to believe that fish evolved into amphibians, you can't claim science for it. Science has to do with things you can observe. What we've been able to observe is a lot of things that we can't observe. A lot of the transitions are just absolutely missing. And so if you want to believe in evolution, that's your business, of course. But I think it's more reasonable to believe that fish have always been fish, amphibians have always been amphibians.